Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is John Humphreys. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Equity and Funding, and I'm pleased to be here with Janelle Marotz this morning. Janelle and I have known each other for, I think it's about a decade. We worked together in Beloit School District, and prior to that, Janelle, you were the business manager in Eau Claire, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and then since then, you've been in, since Beloit, you've been in Denmark schools and been the executive director of business services there. I had a nice opportunity to work with Janelle as treasurer of AEF, so that's been a lot of fun to reconnect around that. Janelle offered to talk about Medicaid reimbursement with AEF today, and it was kind of fun to hear you say, John, we realized in our district we weren't applying for everything either. And so you had a sort of a deep dive into everything that Medicaid could be used for. And you'll talk about that a little bit today. I'll just share a little bit of background as well. I got a call on Wednesday. I was telling Janelle earlier, I got a call on Wednesday from Deb Kerr, who was a candidate for state superintendent. Deb has been also involved. She was the president of the National Superintendents Association, AASA. And she said, John, I really think this Medicaid reimbursement thing is something that a lot of administrators don't know enough about, and it's a great source of funding. So she was excited to have her team from her new district be with us today. And so I think it's neat that there's some national perspective on this as well, Janelle. So you're offering a really great service. And the last thing I'd say about Janelle is that you're one of the nicest people I know. It's just fun to work with you, and your email signature says kind regards, and you certainly have that for everybody you work with. So thank you for your kindness and sharing today with AEF. I'm going to mute and stop my video and welcome Janelle Marotz.
Thank you, John, for the really nice introduction. And I'm really excited to be here today. Like John was saying, in our district, the school district of Denmark, we were looking for sustainable revenue. And so we really looked into the area of Medicaid potential. And even when I was putting these slides together and I had my director of pupil services review them, she noticed that some things had changed in our district. And so an annual review is probably a really great idea too, as things change in your district, just to make sure that our continued focus is on claiming every dollar that we can get that's sustainable. So as we walk through this presentation, please feel free to jump in if you have any questions. You can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. I'd really like this to be very interactive. As John was sharing, we can all learn from each other. I think the more interest we have in this topic, the better we can do together to collect our share of Medicaid. So our goal today is to optimize our Medicaid reimbursement for our district. And this revenue comes from the state through the Wisconsin Medicaid program. And the funding is there for medically necessary services that are provided to children that are eligible to receive Medicaid. So what happens is we turn in our claims, and then the state processes those and the federal government reimburses them, and meanwhile the state pays us. So these are all medical services that are reported in our students that have IEPs for these medical services. So again, our goal is to look at all the areas that are potential to receive this reimbursement and see if you're missing out on some of that revenue. And the best way to look to see if you're collecting all of the costs that you can back to your budget is to do that deep dive that John had referenced. Look through all of the areas of your costs and look at the sources of funding as well. Now, this could end up to be a lot of work because you will need to look at your budgeting of costs. You'll have to look at the project numbers, whether you're using federal money, state or local dollars. But ultimately, you're going to find there may be some opportunities to collect those dollars back. So if you're not documenting all of these claimable services, Some areas you may not be as aware of could be in the areas of transportation and personal care services. This is an area where you could increase your revenue if you're not already claiming Medicaid. In order to claim Medicaid dollars, there are a lot of components that are both legal and auditable. So as you start this process and you're looking to increase that revenue, you need to make sure that your records are in compliance and that you're following all the requirements. The biggest cost that we can claim back is our personnel. These are our providers in our district of those medical services. So they're providing direct services to your students. And these are students that have these services documented in their IEP. And our goal would be to look at all of those people in your district that are providing those types of services and look and see how you're currently funding them. If you're funding them through local sources, you can go ahead and claim the Medicaid on them. However, if you're using your federal dollars, such as IDEA flow through, you would not be able to claim under Medicaid because that would be claiming 2 times under a federal source. So we cannot duplicate those claims. In addition to your personnel costs, you can claim other large expenditures annually. So these could include, say, a changing table for a student or a wheelchair or a lift, for instance. And not only can you claim those large capital expenditures, but you can also claim recurring medical costs such as supplies documented in those students' IEP to meet their needs. So fee-for-service billing, this is the regular billing that is taken care of as those direct services are provided to your students. So these are being claimed as your providers are taking care of these sessions throughout the school year individually with those students. And then these claims are processed quarterly and annually to tie back to those fee-for-services. So I've listed several of the service types here, just so that you could think about your district and if you have these services. And if you do, are you claiming all of them under Medicaid? So the quarterly claiming is a process that allows you to review all of your costs, and this would include your direct costs as well as indirect costs. So you start this process by identifying your pool of personnel that are conducting these services. If they're offering indirect services, then we have to be able to compute how much of those services are spent on those students that are Medicaid eligible. So to do this, there's a process called a random moment time study. This process allows the percent to be determined of how much time the providers are spending on these outreach and support services. So these are the indirect costs, and then these are submitted. This percentage is used on that quarterly claim to determine how much of that cost would be eligible. Then there's a cost settlement process once a year. This happens annually. This allows us to add our direct services. So we're adding all the actual costs of services to this annual report. And then the reconciliation goes through and looks at how much we've received in those interim payments and looks to see how much was allowable. So we're documenting all the claims that we've filed. It's being reviewed. And then this cost settlement process can be really good for us as districts, because we can look back at our records and make any potential corrections in a quarter that we may need to. And then this is used to reconcile, and most likely you're going to receive a payment back to you once a year. However, there could also be a recoupment. You may have a time when you owe money back as well, if this settlement process results in a change.
Janelle, quick question for you.
Yes.
If you go back a couple of slides to all the things that are reimbursable, what did you find as you worked through this in your district? What were the things that you you said, oh, we're starting to do that just for discussion's sake?
Oh, great question. So special education transportation services were being provided in our district. So we use vans that are only used, they're used exclusively for special needs students that have these services written into their IEP, and those weren't being claimed. So in our district, we had to start meeting the requirements, such as implementing the bus logs and tracking that documentation down. So that was a new billing for us. We also found that, we could do a better job overall in our program with the random moment time studies and just the provider documentation. So we actually ended up switching the Medicaid consultant we were using and just spending a lot of time on training and focusing to capture every dollar that we could.
Okay.
Some of the other areas that we found is if we contract out staff, it's easy to miss those. So as you make changes throughout the year, you want to go back and make sure you're claiming every cost.
And then like durable medical equipment is something that's interesting, especially when you have a really high needs student with a disability who's Medicaid eligible, whether that's like feeding tubes or things that the school district is responsible for. I guess feeding tubes probably not a good example, right? That's something that the school district doesn't have to pay for.
That's correct. But since you brought up that the medical services, the attendant care is one that I do hear talked about, to capture those costs for staff members that you may have that are assisting those students in things that may be eligible, such as feeding. You brought up feeding tubes. So
yeah,
the attendant care is another area that you want to make sure you're documenting those costs.
Sure. And then supplies for working with high needs kids, say suctioning devices or diapers or anything that's necessary, not equipment wise, but supply wise, right? That's all reimbursable.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So as we complete the cost reconciliation process, keep in mind that this is going to be a ways out. This all takes time. So while this is happening in the background, you're continuing to submit those regular claims for individual student services. But this process for the annual reconciliation, these are deferred. So when you receive this money back, it could be 18 months to 2 years after you provided these services. So the random moment time study process is really important to the amount of funds you get back, because that determines that overall percentage of the time that your staff are providing to deliver those direct services. For this annual cost report, you are required to report the annual cost for all of those personnel and the annual cost for your district. So these annual costs for your district, in addition to personnel, could include some of those costs that John and I were just talking about, such as the durable medical equipment. Could also include things like fuel for those specialized transportation vans. The annual cost could be really varied from district to district in what you're claiming, depending on what funding source you're using. Then they take the total costs and use that Medicaid eligibility rate within your IEP student population to factor how much of these costs would qualify for Medicaid. So in our case, we have about 235 to 250 students on average that are Medicaid eligible of our special education population. So just a reminder as we complete this claiming process, that in order to claim our personnel, they must be identified on our staff pool list. I found that the pool process can be kind of confusing, so I wanted to spend a little time on this today. So the SBS 1 and SBS 2 cost pools, SBS stands for school-based services. These are your staff members that are delivering those direct services. An example would be a speech therapist or a OT or a PT. So they're providing those direct services on a regularly scheduled basis as listed in the student's IEP. So it could be a social worker providing services, for instance. And the SBS 1 and the SBS 2 pools, those are dictated, those are already set forth which type of service goes in which pool for you. The MAC cost pool, that is the administrative allowable services. So those are the indirect services that are happening in your district. So they include this list that follows. And then on the next slide, I also have it in picture form because I thought the pictures were a lot easier to follow. And I do have the source listed here that this came from another training. So as you review your costs and your services, think of all these outreach activities and think of who's performing these activities as part of their regular duties. We're all really busy, so we want to make sure that you're not spending time on those staff member costs that aren't eligible in those pools. So when you consider your staff, most of your staff are probably direct instruction teachers, so they're in the regular classroom working with your regular education students. Normally, those are not the staff members that you would be able to claim the time on. You'll only include teachers if they're making those referrals or doing coordination, so those indirect types of services, or direct services, such as the speech or nursing, other medical services. Here's some provider examples of the administrative staff. Keep in mind that the job title is not what qualifies the reimbursement. This is based on the duties, and these are not direct services that are provided. These are going to be all indirect. These individuals also have to be properly licensed or credentialed to be able to be claimed and not paid for with federal dollars. So here's some of those medical costs that we were talking about earlier: durable medical equipment, even things like adaptive classroom tools. If you're paying for these out of non-federal dollars, you would want to capture these costs on your annual report and claim them. Concerning your specialized transportation, these are the requirements that you'd have to make sure that you can meet in order to start claiming that transportation under Medicaid. Also, keep in mind that if you have transportation staff that are only working with your regular education student population, when you complete your transportation costs on your annual report, you cannot claim those personnel. You will only be claiming the cost for the staff that are working with your specialized transportation program. So introducing you to this claiming process, the PCG, the Public Consulting Group, facilitates the Medicaid claiming process in the state of Wisconsin, and they are contracted through the Department of Health Services of Wisconsin. So I'm providing here their information. If you click on the link here, this will take you directly to their portal that is used to complete the staff pool list and random moment time studies, as well as the quarterly cost claiming and annual report. I know in different districts, different staff may be involved in this process. You might have some staff that are doing the pool list and another staff that's doing the cost claiming. So I'm trying to put a lot of resources here that you can share with staff amongst your district to help you get started in this. Here's a few helpful hints that I've learned from the claiming process. Don't spend time on staff that are 100% federally funded when you're completing all the costs, because you can't claim them anyway. Make sure that all your providers are appropriately licensed. If they're not, then there's no point in spending time to claim them on your cost report until they do have those credentials. Make sure your salaries and benefits are correct each quarter. So when you get to the annual report, you don't have to go back and have those quarterly reports reopened and make corrections. Use your system-generated payroll data for claiming. In Denmark, we use Skyward Cumulative. And in our system, we are able to upload all of the costs directly to the portal. So if you do have any questions on how to get that started, Skyward can help you, or you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to share some more information related to that. We converted from SMS about a year ago, and that system will do the upload as well. So that can really save a lot of time in generating these costs. There's some minimal setup. Also ensure that staff pool list is also up to date. The timing is a little bit off. So the pool list is compiled in August. So the quarter of October through December can be frustrating when you're hiring new staff, because you may not have identified the name of the new staff member. And if they're not put on that pool list, you won't be able to claim their first quarter costs. So that's something to be cognizant of as you're doing your planning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. A staff person can only be claimed in one of the cost pools. So as you compile your costs, you only need to include each person once.
Can I just jump in again? Sorry. If you go back to that, couple of quick questions. On the first one, when I look at the federal funding question, I guess it makes me think that's another good reason to have people not, special ed folks not paid through federal funds, is that obviously you get the Medicaid claiming, but you can also get the special education categorical aid through the state and the high cost special ed aid, right?
That's correct. You'll want to review all of your staffing, and this will likely result in changes in your general ledger where you're coding these people. In our district, we tried to keep it simple, and we said if they're doing any Medicaid services, so if they're doing that fee-for-service billing, we do not want them in our flow-through grant. So each year we review our staff, and if they're doing any kind of Medicaid services, we put them in the 011 function.
Yeah.
And claim the state and high cost aid both. Yeah.
Okay. And then the licensure question, Janelle, appropriately licensed, they can have an emergency license. Right?
Correct.
That's okay.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any questions at this point? I just want to make sure that anybody who's got anything jumps in, and there's a lot of good information so far. So, all right. Well, everybody, continue to feel free to either raise your hand or unmute and turn on your video, or just unmute, and we'll keep going. Thanks, Janelle.
Your salaried staff is probably your largest cost, and these are going to be your staff that are providing direct services or the indirect services. So as you review your costs, make sure that you include all of their compensation. So this year, for instance, we've been paying a little bit of supplemental pay we didn't pay in the past because of COVID. It could be considered overtime or overload pay. You'll want to make sure you're claiming all of the payments that are eligible under Medicaid, including their paid time off. Make sure you get their contract completion for teachers in there. So you don't have to spend the time pulling off those smaller payments that would qualify. You'll want to include those. Make sure that any staff that are providing these direct medical services are on that cost pool. And like John and I were just talking, you want to make sure they're properly licensed and credentialed. And then include all of their benefits. I listed the ones that most of us think of, but also consider those that aren't on the list. For example, in our district, we have payment in lieu of health insurance, which we can claim. We also make HSA, health savings account contributions, which could be included. So think of those additional benefits that you may be paying that aren't on this list that may qualify, and include those in your claiming process. So your salaried staff that are going to be in that administrative cost pool, again, those are the indirect providers, and these have to be part of their regular duties. Your direct service providers are also going to be claimed in the direct cost pool, and those are going to be delivering the Medicaid allowable services. Another cost to look at where you may not be claiming is your direct support staff. If you have direct support staff that are supporting somebody on that staff pool list, an example would be admin support to your pupil services director, just an example. If you do add those costs into this category of direct support staff, that could increase your claim. Also, keep in mind any contracted staff that you have, you need to claim. Examples of this would be if you're contracting out occupational therapist through CISA. You'll want to put these on your contracted staff pool. And back to the licensing, if you're contracting through CISA, you'll have to make sure that they're properly licensed and have that on file for when you're audited. Specialized transportation requirements, I have those listed here. If you're going to start claiming specialized transportation or already claiming it, you'll want to keep your documentation in order through the claiming process. And when you file your annual report, you'll want to make sure that that's all together. These are the requirements for a vehicle that's going to be used in the specialized transportation. Now to some helpful hints. Some of the claiming issues that could arise that will take time to follow up on would include maintaining your supporting backup. PCG does random audits. They do desk audits, they do on-site monitoring. And so you'll want to make sure that everything's ready. If you get one of those requests, you can just pull out your documentation and share that with them. One of the common requests I've received is for those system generated ledgers out of Skyward that show the project numbers, the breakdown of the types of compensation you're claiming. You'll want to make sure you have that, because if you claim the entire salary of an individual and maybe you paid them, for example, for coaching, you have to prove that you're not claiming something that is not a Medicaid allowable service on your claims. So by having the breakdown that shows what the compensation is for, you can prove that you're not claiming costs that you shouldn't, such as event worker pay or co-curricular pay. So the billing requirements, I know we went through these before, but I do want to point out that consent is an important part of the process. You need to get one-time consent in order to bill Medicaid. So that's part of that administrative process to make sure that's on file. You could have a student that is eligible to receive Medicaid, but you don't have the consent, so you can't process that billing. This was something that I had talked about earlier that has really helped our district, is to use a vendor that offers Medicaid tracking and claim management services. They also can provide the software that helps you meet all these documentation requirements. And the high cost claims that John was referring to are actually due today to the Department of Public Instruction. And one thing that really has helped me with having a vendor for these Medicaid services is that when I fill out that high cost claim, I have to deduct all the Medicaid revenue I've received for those high cost students. And in my case, I can just reach out to this vendor and they can give me those amounts. So I don't have to go back through all my remittance advices and try to figure out how much revenue I've received during that specific time period for those students. So these vendors can be very useful in a variety of ways, in addition to the tracking and claim management.
Hey, me again. Question for you on the consent. I remember years ago hearing from a parent who said something along the lines of, we don't want to consent because there's a lifetime maximum claiming for their child with a very significant disability in Medicaid. In other words, there was, I think at the time, it was like $1 million lifetime maximum. Do you know anything about that, Janelle? Is that still an issue? Have you had any trouble getting consent? Any other information on that?
I haven't looked at those requirements recently, so I don't feel like I can speak to that.
Okay.
But as far as the consent, yes, we do have students that are Medicaid eligible that we do not have consent on.
Yeah.
So
okay.
we try to get consent, But if it's not on file, then we can't move forward, obviously, with the claiming process. And that's another reason to have these vendors, because I can go to work with these vendors who do know all of that information and can help us move forward with getting that consent. So this is just an action plan sample of areas you can look at if you're already claiming Medicaid to try to figure out how to increase the amount you're receiving. Training your pool staff, you can do that in-house, but if you're working with, again, a Medicaid vendor, they can help you with this. They have all this expertise to make sure you're getting back those random moment time study samples from your staff, and to provide the training so that when they complete their random moment samples, they're putting in the correct code. If they're not putting in the correct code when they complete them, then it could decrease your revenue. You also want to increase your fee-for-service reimbursements. So make sure you review your billing systems, that you're claiming everything you can and that you're meeting all those requirements. Capture that Medicaid parental consent we just talked about, and review with your providers all the types of claimable services and make sure they are documenting those and that those are getting claimed. This again is an area where your vendor can really help you with. Here's some wonderful resources from PCG, and they're very responsive. So if you have any questions for them, I included all their contact information at the bottom of the screen there. These are all recorded trainings, so I thought this could help you. You could pass this along to someone else in your district if there's multiple people involved in the Medicaid process. Here's some more information from the Department of Public Instruction. And again, just make sure that you're looking to increase your fee-for-service reimbursements. So look at those 100% federally funded positions you have now. Maybe you can move some of those to locally funded positions and capture the Medicaid reimbursement for those. Ensure all your providers are documenting all services so that you can claim them. And then make sure you provide that training. Review your remittance advices and make sure that you're running that Medicaid eligibility monthly, because there could be changes in the status of your students that are Medicaid eligible. Follow up on any claims that have been denied and resubmit those. These again are areas that your Medicaid vendor is going to help you with. Now I really want to open it up to you to hear your stories, hear your successes, maybe even frustrations you have in this process. I've learned so much from so many different people, and I'm hoping that we could have a little bit of discussion so that we can all learn from each other.
Janelle, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we might be able to see more of who's with us. And I guess the one thing that I thought that might be really helpful to just hear a little bit about, you talked about the transportation, the high cost transportation that you did. So you've got to have a specialized vehicle or have an aide on the vehicle. And then you have to log the miles, and it has to be a part of the child's IEP. And after that, it's pretty straightforward, right?
Correct. Yes. In our case, we weren't generating those logs, and so our Medicaid provider helped us start those transportation logs and get all of our documentation in order.
Gotcha. Nice. Yeah, and it's those simple things. I mean, logging miles takes about a minute, if that, and then you get money back. I mean, these are simple things, and it may not be tens of thousands of dollars, but each one of those things can be really helpful and turn into a nice source of revenues. What other questions are out there? I see Deb and Jenny.
Hi, John.
I'm here to get ideas, so.
Yeah, Bob had sent me the link and asked me to just attend to make sure that we are doing everything we can to capture our dollars. I think, I've been able to increase our revenue quite a bit by looking at all of these things. Just recently though, like last year, there are a few things that I just want to verify some changes. We no longer log miles because it's just a flat mileage for all students. Is that your understanding for transportation?
Yeah, our transportation logs themselves are really very, very simple.
Yep.
We also maintain mileage logs just as a general rule for our fleet. But
Yeah,
yeah,
we do too. Yeah.
they're so easy. You know, it's kind of scary when you hear about bus logs and all this documentation, but it's pretty easy to put it into action. So that's a
Okay.
really good point.
I just wanted to make sure that that was what everyone was doing, because we no longer log the actual miles of those trips. We do just a fleet mileage for the, the trip versus individual mileage for each one of the students. Because last year they said it's just a flat rate now.
Yeah, so we do the attendance log that they're
Yep.
receiving the daily. So we're probably both doing the same thing. It's just a very
Okay.
simple, ours is on paper, just a simple paper form
Yep, that's what
that
I
we
use.
collect. Great.
And then the other thing is with the transportation, I always wait to make sure that all the other claims are submitted, so that attendant care as well, because I know you said if they receive a medical service, but also if they're receiving attendant care, right? The transportation is reimbursable.
Yes.
Okay, so I always make sure all the other claims are submitted, so that when we do the transportation, that everything has been submitted. Do you know, or I'm always worried that if somebody's behind on submitting their billing, that we'll miss out on that opportunity.
That's a really good point. I think that's why you want to make sure you have somebody that's really on top of your billing. And I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because that was a frustration we had. And one of the reasons we switched providers is because that timing, that's all got to flow. You gotta be right on top of your billing. So yeah, keep sharing. This is good information.
Yeah, to be honest with you, ours is, we do submit ours through CISA, but I save my transportation and submit it all at the end of the school year. That way then, because we have some contracted providers in that, and if they're behind on their billing, which I don't always know that, I'll ask them to run those reports a couple times a year, but so then I just wait and submit it all. To make sure
like
that
one lump
everything-
sum. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And I've worked with some other districts too, that, their speech and language hadn't submitted for months and months and months. Well, then you're losing out on those dollars if you submit transportation, but those haven't been received, that they haven't submitted anything for speech and language.
Correct, because you're not showing they got the service.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good point.
And then the other question I had is that last year we were told through our provider to not do as much attendant care billing as we were doing. Worried that it was going to affect our, oh gosh, my terminology here, our cost settlement. They didn't want it to be where we would owe anything in a cost settlement. So, which was confusing, because for years I worked hard to increase our school or attendant care billing, and then they basically said you don't want to do too much attendant care billing and then have it affect that at the end, where you would be in a repayment situation.
Correct. They call it recoupment. But yes, because at the time you're doing those billings, it's my understanding that you don't know how your cost reconciliation is going to turn out, because that's all based on those random moment time studies. Depending on your success in that area. Yeah, we've had some recoupment too.
Okay.
It's really hard to keep all the pieces together.
Yeah.
And as you know, it's really delayed. That reimbursement and that recoupment is delayed. So it's incredibly frustrating if you get to that point. And then you have to try to understand what happened.
Yeah. Well, and then try to explain it to staff, because, I'm on them, I was on them forever to make sure that we're doing this. And now it's like, oh, and by the way, forget that. We don't. So, yeah, I just wanted to know if that was everybody's understanding, and
And I thought I was the only person that they came back and recouped funds on. So that's, yeah,
And
that's kind of neat that you brought that up, because all that timing and that you think you're being so on top of it. And then the calculations come out and change the allowable amounts.
yeah. And I don't know if there's any way that we can, somehow make sure, I don't know if there's a way that we could be maximizing that or figuring that out. I'm not sure.
So just a question for you. Do you go back and check on your coding and do you go back and do like internal audits or spend time to see how those are being coded, your random moment time studies?
No,
Do you know your percent? Like, I believe it has to be 85%.
I
And you really
do-
want to be at 100%, but
I do go in and make sure that everybody's completed their random moment time studies. I have talked about staff on, the importance of answering those, appropriately, rather than just like in a meeting. If you're in an IEP meeting, put that,
yes.
IEP meeting, or if you're dealing like with the principal, like in one of my districts at one time, the principals also did like all of the meds. They were the ones who gave out medication. So just making sure that they were very specific on what they were doing. But the coding, I guess, is something, when you say that, I'm not aware of what that would be.
Yeah, because I'm not sure that our staff always understand the importance. I like you do. I try to stress that. It's not, I was on the phone with a parent. I was on the phone with a parent talking about free and reduced meals, or, it does have to be very specific. And it's easy for them to just fill it out fast and just put those general things. Yeah, met with a parent, don't even talk about what the meeting was about.
Right.
Yeah, that wouldn't qualify as a eligible service if it's not specific.
And then that is that answer, then that's what you're talking about when you say how it's coded and figures into your percentage, not just the percentage that's completed, but the percentage that actually were eligible services.
Correct. Because if it's not specific enough, I'm afraid they're going to throw it out. So I work with our, I guess I count on the consultant that we work with on the training aspect and trying to help us meet those marks. But I personally, we're a pretty small district, so I personally don't go back and, verify. And so I was just curious, when you're talking about all these details, if there's anyone out there that does, and how they accomplish that, getting that at 100% and getting that training done. We're all so busy, how you get that success.
Just a question for the two of you, and maybe Jenny too, or anybody else. Are you using, how much are you doing with student services, Medicaid claiming, social work, psychology, counseling? I'm sure your nursing services that's probably a pretty easy one, but what about the other three pupil services areas? I know when I was a director, or even back when I was a school psychologist, where I was told, well, we're a little reticent to put these services into IEPs because you don't know if they're going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess the example that comes to mind is, say, a social worker who is working with the parent of a high need student on a regular basis. Even if you put in once a month for a half an hour, you would estimate that in the course of that month, that parent would be working with that student services worker, a social worker, at least 30 minutes. That's a claimable expense. Are you doing those kinds of things? What are you seeing in that regard?
In Denmark, we are claiming them. For instance, we could have a high cost student that does have that 30-minute session where they're working on social interaction.
I claim them too. It's been difficult to get like my school counselors and people to understand the need to do that. And then also building that into the IEP and having my teachers understand if we're providing those sessions, so the school counselor, versus if it's a school-based service that's provided by an outside agency, we don't put that in the IEP. So I just make sure to review those IEPs carefully. to make sure that it's listed appropriately in related services.
And I know you were speaking of the high cost claim, but everything we try to claim, we have to have it documented in the IEP. So Deb, that's awesome that you're going back and doing that, because yeah, if it's not in the IEP for all these programs, we can't get reimbursed. And that's a lot of work. So that's awesome that you're following up on that.
Jenny, are there things that you wanted to ask about?
I was just going to share, for us, it is primarily nursing. I mean, part of it is just the current student population. We've talked about it a little bit around school counseling, but we've had a lot of turnover in that area. So it's just not something that we've gotten developed, but like we would be interested in it if it made a fit.
Hi, Jenny. I didn't realize that you were on here.
So do you have other successes? You guys are so good at this. Do you have other things to share that our audience can benefit from? That's so awesome that you're here.
I guess my, and John, maybe you can speak to this a little bit too, is, you know, working with the superintendents to understand the need to not use our flow through dollars when we're billing for our students, and claiming categorical aid and moving that over. But I've been met with some resistance on why we should do that. And it would be nice if somehow, and I don't know if it's out there or not, but that we could look at a comparison to show how we're actually could be increasing our revenue by doing it this way versus keeping some of those staff positions in flow through dollars or federal dollars.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, because I too remember trying to explain on a whiteboard to a new superintendent when I was a student services director, here's where all these dollars moving matter. And we didn't have a business manager, we had a bookkeeper, and she was great. But it was really interesting to try to explain that to him and have him understand why and at that time we were using Title I IDA set aside. And so that became another variable that really maximized our categorical aid dollars. It came up in the R.W. Baird session that AEF held a couple of weeks ago with Debbie and Mary, and they talked about it for a few minutes, and then we're going to actually have another session with them coming up, and I asked that we create a kind of a flow chart, and to your point, Deb, like a comparison, here's how much you're capturing, you know, in the two scenarios, and really just a sort of a good way of looking at the dollars and the revenues that your district will get if you code them one way versus another. I think a lot of people run into this problem where they don't feel like they know what to do with the IDA dollars, and so let's throw a bunch of staff in there. And there's good ways to work around that, I think.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's like I said, well, you know, Bob doesn't work on Friday, so he's like, you need to go to this. So that's why I'm here today. But this has been really great information. But I would love information to show, to be able to go back and say, this is why we should do this in the budget, because that's been one area where there's been a little bit of confusion or resistance to doing that.
Yeah. And you know what, it might even call for just an individual session just on that, because it can be complicated enough, and it would benefit from some lengthier conversation, I think.
Okay.
Deb, I'm just curious. So on I can look at my Medicaid revenue when I started in the district and see how it's changed over time. Is that something that, I know it's simple, but is that something that would help, showing that, every year those additional dollars are coming in?
Yeah, sometimes it helps. I don't work for CISA anymore, but when I was at CISA, just because I had done this at my previous district as a teacher, and really had worked hard at claiming everything we could for school-based services and nursing services. When I went to CISA, I actually worked with a couple districts to increase their revenue, one right down the road from where I'm at now. In a year's time, we increased our revenue like $45,000.
Oh yeah.
And then the
Mhm.
CISA person said, no, they stopped doing it since you're not going in there and making sure that it's done. So it's just, I don't know. I'm not sure why some districts or superintendents don't take more advantage of this. So that's it. But you can see, I mean, we used to run those reports all the time of the different districts and how much their revenue was and how much it could be increased, or it had increased over time, but
Yeah, that's all I really have too. I haven't really, I guess, taken the time, like you said, that deep dive into it, but I can see it right in the, the Medicaid revenue collections over time and the trend
Yes.
analysis. Can see it's
Yeah.
really jumped up. Both, the administrative claiming and the both of them, both Fund 10 and Fund 27. So I always talk about the change in the transfer to Fund 27.
well, that's a whole nother thing.
Well, unless there are any other questions or comments or thoughts, I think it's about time to wrap up. I'll just pause here and ask if anybody else has anything to share. All right. Well, hearing none, thanks again, Janelle, for your expertise. And I will be posting these slides. There is this recording will go up on our YouTube channel here shortly. And on the YouTube channel, you'll have a link to a Google Drive that has all the slides from all of the presentations. So I'll post Janelle's slides here in a few minutes as well. And thanks again, Janelle. Really appreciate your time and expertise.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.